We are live streaming right now. We started a live stream a few seconds ago, I think. So we're on YouTube Live. I don't think that your image can be seen, but if you don't want if you want to guarantee your face can't be seen, then please hide your video screen. So again, just like yesterday, Ted's going to talk, and then we'll take maybe 3 or 4 questions at the end. It's going to be more of a lecture format for these. And if you want to ask a question, we're not going to be taking hands today because of the YouTube Live issue. But if you want to ask a question, type a chat message to me. I'm James French. You can see my name there, and you can type me a question, and I'll read off questions without naming names. Okay, so we're going to wait for we're just going to wait for a little bit to allow more people to filter in. Okay. All right, and folks who just joined us, again, if you would like to ask a question, if you have any questions for Ted, we will be taking a couple of questions at the end of the lecture, maybe 3 or 4. If you'd like to ask a question, type it into the chat box. Type it to me, James French, and I'll be reading them off at the end. Okay, so thank you. And Tara, let's transition. Okay, Ted.
Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about how the human form evolved. I've always been captivated by the human form. I think there's something so inexplicably beautiful about it. There are so many animals in the animal kingdom that move better than us. Some are more agile, some are faster. There are animals that can fly. And yet there's something about the human form that is almost spiritual. We're rooted in the earth, and yet when you see a child or the form of a beautiful adult standing, there's something spiritual about it. So our upright posture reflects something that you don't see in any of the other animals. From the evolutionary point of view, sometimes people speak about upright posture as if it's the result of morphological changes or changes in our form or shape from earlier forms. One of the most, let's say, salient features that defines us as humans, for instance, is the shape of our spine. In order for a 4-footed animal to go back in its hind legs and come up so that it's standing upright, the spine has to change shape. So we often refer to that change, and we'll talk about that in a minute. That's the shape, the lumbar curve in the spine is the main change we see there. In order for that to happen, we think of that as a kind of a trade-off. It's more advantageous to stay 4-footed because the back is not as stressed as in a human upright posture, where the lower back endures a lot more stress and strain. But describing the human body and the human form, the structure of the human body, purely in terms of morphological changes, hardly even remotely begins to do justice to the fact that going upright releases a whole new set of emergent faculties not found in any other animal. We're not simply the result of a change or two from an earlier animal. We're an entirely new design form. And in addition to being a new design form with whole new capabilities, we are architecturally an amazingly complex structure, so that even that lumbar curve we're speaking about is hardly just a curve change in the spine, but is part of a larger dynamic of muscles and bones and connective tissues, which literally constitutes the most complex architectural structure in the known world. So today we're going to look at some of those changes that enabled us to become upright, how that story took place, but also how it allows new functions to come into being. And the very first one I wanted to mention, I want to show you first a couple of, I want to show you a couple of simple images of that human form here. This is a play on the discus, this is in one of my books, on the discus, the famous Greek sculpture. We see it in these beautiful.
And Ted sharing.
Oh, sorry, James, I forgot. Again, 1 second. Oh, here it is. So here we see some of the sort of the beauty of the human form here and here. This is the discus thrower, and here, this is a drawing a very good friend of mine did of the famous winged victory, the Nike statue. Captures that sort of beautiful spiritual quality you see in the human form. One of the very first things we see, and I want to talk about, is in looking at how the human form evolved. We're going to begin here with fishes that came out of the ocean, the very first amphibians. You could see here that some of these early amphibians had very fleshy limbs that enabled them to crawl about in the shallows. Probably this was happening even in the water. But that enabled them to come onto land, perhaps to escape predators, whatever the reason. They were able to stay on land for increasingly long periods and then eventually to breathe air, because a fish in the water is actually breathing, getting their oxygen from the water. These amphibians were able to begin to get air from oxygen from the air. And that enabled that, or that led to a change in the structure of the fins, which you see here in an early fish or an early amphibian. That structure became that. This is a huge change because now the structure of that fin, which you could see if you look here, you could see that there's a very definite arrangement of bones. There's sort of a big girdle here. There's one bone here, if you could see that, 2 bones, and then kind of a cluster of bones, and then a kind of a radial group of bones here. That arrangement of bones in the animal that comes onto land becomes a very definite arrangement now of levers. In other words, the bones now become not just a set of bones that support a fin, but movable levers that form joints with the other levers. And that same structure of articulating bones that we see here in this amphibian is the same arrangement that we see in the human being. So again, you have this sort of girdle, 1 bone, 2 bones, a cluster of bones, and then kind of radial bones. We have here a girdle, our scapula, the 1 bone of the humerus, the 2 bones of the forearm, a cluster of carpal or wrist bones, and then the radial bones of the hand. These, of course, from the amphibian to the human is a big leap, which we're going to talk about, because to get from one to the other, you've got to become 4-footed in a certain way and then go up onto the hind legs. But here already we see features of the human being, or what's going to become the human being in this particular line that led to humans. We see features of that emerging just in the formation of the limbs. And the same thing happens with the pelvic fin of the fish, which has that arrangement of bones here that support the fin. But that arrangement becomes this arrangement where, again, you have this sort of pelvic bone here, or girdle, kind of girdle, similar to, in a way, to the scapula of the shoulder. You have one bone here, which would be the femur, two bones, and then a cluster of bones that become the ankle and foot. And again, if you look at it in the human being, you see that same arrangement, the kind of scapula of the pelvic bone, or the girdle for the supporting the joint of the hip. You have the long bone of the femur, the two bones of the lower leg, a cluster of ankle or tarsal bones, and then radial bones forming the feet. And all of those arrangements together make for this animal that's able to move on the ground and becomes an articular structure, a structure of articulating bones, which we take for granted. But when I'm moving my arms here, that's the result of a fish coming out of the water using its fin-like structure in a much more clearly articulated way that becomes the limbs in animals, particularly primates, that develop later on. Tomorrow, when we look at skill, because that's the topic for tomorrow, we're going to see that the development of limbs with these very clearly articulating bones that you could see, they're very defined, and there's a huge range of motion involved in the fingers, hands, thumbs, forearm, arms, and this shoulder joint, which is the most mobile joint in the body. That the use of the limbs and those articulating joints actually represents a very big step in the evolution of skill in mammals, particularly in mammals that come onto land. Then there is the next sort of big leap, which is so here's all these articulating joints. So here we see that the limbs can move so freely, and that represents a whole level of skill as compared to fish that have only this sort of flapping body that just flaps like this. Here you see these limbs, as they've developed in humans, have become so complex, which we're going to look at in a moment. The next big step, you could say, is going to be the development of upright posture. In order to go upright, clearly the trunk has to be brought onto the hind limbs of an animal moving on land. So we now have an animal moving on land, not the reptile or the amphibian, but even more advanced, more like a mammal. In order for that animal to go up on its hind limbs and to go upright, a number of changes have to happen. And here we could see it as a sequence. Here you have the fish, you have the reptile. Here you have something like a cat and a gorilla and the human. And you could see what has to happen for this animal. We didn't evolve from a cat. We evolved from something more like a smaller rodent-like kind of creature. But the idea is the same. If you have a spine here that's shaped with a kind of a broad curve and then another curve here. So the broad curve of the whole body and the limbs in front and back. So the spine is a kind of like a bridge between the rear and forelimbs, and then that curve supporting the head. In order for that animal to come upright, the spine begins to have to transform in shape until it goes fully upright in the human being, and then the spine becomes much more differentiated. in the fish, the spine is almost undifferentiated. It really is just one flexible beam, and it tapers toward the back to make a tail. And when the flexible beam is waved back and forth, the tail waves and propels the animal forward. The spine becomes a little more differentiated here between the fore and hind limbs, and you begin to get these structures developing, which we just saw in the girdles in front and back. And then you see in this cat a much more developed kind of spine where you have very definite curves, more similar to ours. You have the neck and the thoracic and the pelvic area, but you don't have a lumbar curve. And here you could see it very definitely developing a curve in the lumbar region that supports upright posture. So this is a major change that allows the first primates to evolve as they to an upright posture. So I want to say a little bit about that upright posture and what that lumbar curve looks like. So if you have a simple structure like this, that has a big curve, it's obviously going to be weighted in such a way that it's going to fall forward. It would be much easier to support it if it had another curve to balance this one like this, just like that. So two kind of balancing curves like this. And that's what happens with our spines. If you look here, at the kind of a cat trying to stand up in its rear legs, you could see that it's got a little bit of a curve here that's supporting the head, but the whole thing is weighted forward. This is one reason why a cat or a dog, they're able to go up on their hind legs, but only for a short period. They're not very well designed to do that, and they can't extend their legs fully, etc. But the whole thing is weighted forward, rather like this, this clothes hanger, because it's going to fall forward. In order for that structure to be balanced upright, you want to have another curve in this area so that the sum total of curves makes it more just like a straight object. Imagine a straight object running through here. You could have curves that go one way and curves that go the other way, but it's going to the sum total of the curves is more like a plumb line, so it can support a vertical posture much more easily. And that's what happens with our lumbar curve. And I'm going to show you in a second a bit of a animation of this that I had done. So I asked someone to do a kind of an animation for me, where she put together a series of still shots that could, like a two-dimensional images that you could put together into a sequence to show how this gorilla-like spine structure turns into a human structure. And I'm going to play it a couple times because it goes very quickly, and then I'll slow it down. So here it goes. And ends up being vertical. And then I'll slow it down even more. So here you see in the gorilla, you could see something like a lumbar curve forming here in some of the more advanced primates like gorillas, because they're already beginning to be erect and they need to have a curve going that way, kind of. But it's not enough to support fully erect posture. And you could see that as this goes fully upright, you could see how that curve here begins to develop until you have the full curve in the human spine. And then I think we just sort of highlight it there in red. And of course, what that does is it frees the arms. So the arms now become completely, they become completely altered in their structure and function and their capabilities. So the next part of, or another aspect of I want to show you of. Can you see that, James? Yeah.
Yes, Ted.
So the next aspect of upright posture I wanted to show that I think is also an amazing sort of emergent design is the way we are formed around a vertical axis. If you think about a four-footed animal, they're capable of amazing twisting movements. Anyone, if you have a cat, or if you've observed how they can leap and how they can twist their bodies so effectively, they're capable of these twisting rotational movements. But going to the vertical posture in humans has enabled something that you don't see in any other animal, which is the muscles, the obliquely running muscles that go around the trunk and that also wrap into the limbs, make it possible to twist and turn the body in a way that no other animal can on a vertical axis. So here's an example with that discus thrower of some of the muscles. They're no continuous muscles. These red lines are not a continuous group of muscles. They're actually patches of muscles put together. But if you follow different groups of muscles, you could trace spirals wrapping around the trunk. And here's another version of it showing the actual muscle groups. So here, beginning on the right side of this person at the hip, you could see there's oblique muscles here that go to the midline. And if you follow a different layer of oblique muscles here and through the rib cage, it wraps around and now to the back left side, go to the midline in the back and then cross the midline. And another oblique muscle runs to the skull, ending on the same right side that it began, but in back. So here you begin on the right side in front, it wraps around, goes to the left side, wraps around, crosses again to the right side and ends up in the right side and back. These spirals make it possible for us to perform movements that no other animal can perform. Here's another, I want to show you one more image of spirals, because when you put the different spirals together, beginning with one spiral, we looked at a minute ago, we looked at this spiral starting, I think here, right? Right side in front, yeah, here. But you could also start on the left side, and then you could also start in back. So you get two double spirals, and they're wrapping from the pelvis all the way to the skull. And you can even go down the legs and, oh, sorry, did I not share this one? And you could even hear the two spirals, two in front on the right side and the left side. One goes from the right round to the back right, and the one here on the left, round to the back left, and then two starting in the back. So you essentially get a double spiral arrangement, making it possible to perform incredibly complex movements. So, oh, and then I'll show you one more image. It's hard to describe the complexity of what that makes possible, but if you think, even just sitting here, if you think about my ability, here's the arm complex, which we're going to speak about in a second. But here we have this articular complex that can do this. So I could swing some. Let's say I'm swinging a tennis racket or a ping pong racket. That's a simple movement I'm making from the arm. If I add to it the spiraling movements that I can make with my body, it becomes far more complex. And if you add to that the shifting movements that I can make with my whole weight, now you get what happens when people are performing sports or doing taekwondo or doing tai chi, where you have all kinds of complex movements that become possible, and quite literally an infinite number of movements that are possible because the entire structure of the human form on the vertical axis is able to spiral and use all these complex articular systems to make infinite variety of movements. And that includes skilled actions that we don't normally associate with movement, like playing violin, which is actually a very complex spiraling kind of movement and isn't just something you do with your hands or arms. And I'll just show you one more image of kind of a whimsical image of how the whole human body is vertically poised on that around that central axis. And yesterday, someone mentioned the visual sense. You could see that with the head rotating on that axis, with all that spiral musculature, we quite literally become capable of getting a 360-degree field of vision, even though we're when we're standing, we're looking forward. So when I'm walking, I could turn my head and get a very wide range of vision. I'm higher off the ground than if I were four-footed. And all of that is made possible by the fact that I've gone upright with the lumbar and the other curves of the spine that make upright posture possible. And the whole thing is built around that vertical axis with all those spiraling muscles. Quite an amazing structure. Okay, the next piece of this that I wanted to look at is, I want to say a little bit more about the architecture. I mentioned earlier that if you think about how the human upright posture evolved, and you see it in terms of these morphological changes, you say, well, here's the spine of a four-footed animal, but to come upright, you have to develop a curve in the lumbar spine, so you have one more curve there. That's simple. That seems as if it accounts for how we're poised vertically on 2 feet or standing bipedally on 2 feet. But in reality, the ability of a structure to sit, of a human being to sit on the sit bones or to stand on 2 feet requires an amazing, amazing architectural complexity. And I wanted to share an image relating to that conveys a little bit of that complexity. But it's an image of a four-footed animal, not a bipedal animal, because even though I've done, in my writing and some of my books, I've done a lot of illustrations, I've included illustrations that show some of the complexity. It's hard to do it with humans because it's so, I don't know, it's so subtle. Here you could see it a little more clearly in this four-footed animal, but here's an image of a rabbit. And in this image, the musculoskeletal connections are shown as lines. So all those lines you see here are muscles running between bony contacts, muscles and connective tissue running between bony contacts. And you could see that this is anything but a bony structure that simply, changed shape in order for this animal to be four-footed. To say that it's a bony or, a morphological design is leaving out the fact that it's really an incredibly dynamic architectural structure that doesn't just have bones or a shape to it, but has a dynamic balance maintained by muscles, connective tissue, and bones all working together. And one of the features of that structure, when we look at a structure like that, is that the bones aren't just a bunch of pieces kind of stacked up like a wall or something that are moved by muscles, so that muscles are kind of like machines or motors that move parts of the bone, but the bones are basically account for how it stands. It's quite the opposite. You could even argue that not only do the bones not support the structure, but most of the support comes from these other guy wires running between bones. In other words, we are not a bony structure that's moved and supported by muscles. We're a bone, muscle, connective tissue architecture in which bones are embedded in the whole to support us in a field of gravity. If you doubt that, all you have to do is consider what happens when you're standing, because if I'm standing, you say, well, here aren't the bones all stacked in my spine. Well, what happens when I'm doing this? What happens when I lean over? What happens when I'm crawling? What happens when I'm turning? All those things all those movements show that we're anything but a bunch of stacked bones. We're in fact a very complex network of muscle and connective tissue that supports the bones and then uses the bones as bony contacts to move. And that's what we see here in this rabbit, which doesn't even show the complexity involved in the human being. This kind of a structure, when we're speaking about bones and muscles working together as an architectural combination of dynamic forces, is sometimes called a tensegrity or even biotensegrity structure. So here you see the line joint of this musculoskeletal system of a rabbit reveals a complex tensegrity structure underneath. And I want to show you now how that works, or just sort of a key element of how that works in the human being. So I'm just trying to escape. Okay. So in the human being, being upright, the skull is no longer sitting on, in front of the spine as it would in a rabbit. So we just saw a rabbit where you have a spine. Let's say that's the spine, and then you have the head sitting out in front, like we see it at the familiar, form of a dog or a cat or a rabbit, where the head would be in front. You have a long spine forming a bridge between the forelimbs and the hind limbs. Of course, in humans, the whole thing comes upright. The spine is vertical. The skull is sitting on top. What is the skull doing up there? Well, a lot of anatomy books, a lot of movement books over the last 50 years, or perhaps much more, often depict the skull as sitting on top of the vertically positioned spine. But it's not nearly as simple as that, because for that skull to sit on top of the spine in such a way that the whole thing doesn't get compressed and the whole thing doesn't shorten with muscles pulling down, in order for that structure to actually support itself vertically and upright against gravity, the head has to counterbalance the pull of muscles which want to pull back on the head. And I'll show you a simple example of that in here with this image. So here on the left, you could see what would be something like the head of a cat. So this is from one of my books, my illustrator. I said, can you just do a mechanical drawing showing how the head in a cat sits in front of the spine as if there's just a hinge there, and it's just sort of falling out in front. It's sort of cantilevered or sitting in front and can hinge at the head neck joint here. And he gave, just to make it clear that this was a cat, he gave the whiskers and ears. And here we could see that the cat's head wants to fall down. And it does, it would go like that. In fact, if a cat has neurological problems and its motor system can no longer work properly, the head will begin to droop like this. That's a sign of age and very serious problems. But muscles have to keep it from falling. But they don't just keep it from falling down. Of course they do, they maintain the posture of the head. But the head at the same time acts on the muscles in such a way that the whole thing is elongated. And we often see that in cats when they run and leap, their body seems to elongate naturally. That's part of the tensegrity design that we see here. Here you see with the rabbit that there are a bunch of muscles attaching to the head here at the neck that keep the head from falling, but the falling of the head at the same time is keeping those muscles stretched. That's what it means when we say that this thing is not simply a bunch of bones being acted upon by muscles, but is a very complex, bony, muscular, connective tissue, architectural tensegrity structure. The whole thing is bones embedded with a network of muscles that do a lot of the job of supporting the whole structure with as little effort as possible. Here we see it in an even more simple mechanical version. But what happens with the human head balance? If the head is sitting on top of the spine, can it exert a stretch the way the cat's head does? It can't. It's sitting up on top. And if it's sitting up on top, you think all it could do is press down in the spine. Well, the answer is that it doesn't just sit on top. It sits on top in such a way that it falls or rotates forward. And in doing that, it exerts an upward pull on the muscles in back, which enables the spine to maintain length. And you could see this. I'm going to show you that in a second. You could see this in human beings just sitting. If we're sitting in such a way that all the muscles here begin to shorten and we slump, the head falls back, and you could see that the spine and the trunk can no longer support themselves. Whereas when the head is naturally balancing forward, it's part of a natural lengthening of the whole spine and trunk, which is what we saw in the case of this beautiful young child here, who is sitting in such a way that the head is naturally balanced forward and the spine is naturally lengthening. And often you see in a child this age, maybe around 2 years old, often you see this kind of perfectly natural, effortless upright balance. So I'm going to show you here a simple example or a sequence that we looked at yesterday of how the balance from this primate, earlier primate, non-human primate, changes and goes to a fully upright balance. You could see that kind of sequence happening here. And again, we're going to see it quickly and then I'll slow it down. Here it is quickly. So again, I'll show you quickly. Okay, now I'll hold the cursor so you could see it even more slowly. So here you see the head rather like that of a cat, where the head is angled out in front of the spine and the spine is rather horizontal. It's starting to get a little more vertical, but the head is still cantilevered or sitting out in front of the spine. But you could see in this sequence that in other primates, the whole begins to migrate at the back of the head. The whole begins to migrate below. So the spine can now come below this, a little more below the spine to support the skull, and even more here until you're beginning to be something recognizably human, and even here until you get to the clearly human form where the skull is sitting on top of a vertical spine. And what's so incredible about that is that, as we saw yesterday, in this amazing fossil find in the skull like that, and this is that replica we saw yesterday of what was then the very earliest hominid or first upright primate ever discovered. You see that unlike a four-footed animal, which would be like this, with the skull sitting out from the spine would be here, the skull would sit out in front and would tend to fall. Here you could see that the whole comes underneath, so it goes from here to here to here to create this upright design, and now the spine is directly underneath and the skull is sitting on top. Except the skull is not just some casual weight that just happens to be up there held by muscles. The skull is sitting on top, but it's sitting on top in such a way that it falls forward, so that instead of falling forward this way, and the whole architectural structure has all these guy wires and muscles acting in cooperation with the bony structure, here the whole thing falls forward this way, and the spine can lengthen this way. And that's what we see in this And that's what we see in this design here, where, I'm going to go to the next, the skull balancing forward like this tends to exert an upward force on the spine and the muscles in back, in the same way that a skull in a cat falling forward or down, falling down to the ground, tends to exert a lengthening force on the spine horizontally. So the final piece of this I wanted to show you was the arm. We looked a little bit at the arm and shoulder girdle, and I wanted to show you a little more of this. So the shoulder girdle and the muscular articular complex. So we saw that in an animal that's in the water that comes onto land, the fin, the bony structure of the fin becomes what in humans is a shoulder girdle and arm and hand. And again, you could see it in terms of morphology and say, well, yeah, there's a few bones here that get longer and a few bones that begin to articulate better, and you have joints that work better. But that barely even begins to do justice to the complexity of the structure, because what begins to happen is you begin to get new movement, variety of movement, new kinds of movement that you don't see in any other animal. So I'm here, if you look here, imagine if you wanted to form joints to support each arm. Right? So imagine that I wanted to, I'm going to stop the share for a second. Imagine that you now have these long bones of the upper arm, of the lower arm, and at the end of the hand, and you want to create a very mobile joint here. Clearly, in animals that run, it's not like the fin of a fish. You need to have mobility here. Certainly in primates, and a human primate that comes upright, you need to have a lot of mobility here. Well, how do you do that? If you created just a rigid structure here, this would be able to move, but it wouldn't be able to move quite as much as you need. And if you look at the design in humans, it's not a rigid structure like this. This would be like a rigid structure to support on each side the long bone of the upper arm. It's not like this. It's much more like this, where not only do you have a sort of a socket for the arm bone here and a socket over here for the right arm, but the socket itself moves. So now you have a structure where the arm can move in relation to the socket or scapula, because that's what that is. That's the scapula of the arm. But the socket itself moves in relation to the rib cage. And that makes it possible now, not simply to swing the arm at the joint like this, but to move the whole thing in a huge arc of movement. So we have this incredible range of motion for what? For positioning the hand. And that's what this does. This gives us an incredibly powerful shock-absorbing structure for positioning the hand in order to do things. And then in addition to that, the bones of the forearm and arm and the hand also become more than modified. They become like a whole new emergent structure for doing things with our hand. And here's an example, another part of this mechanism showing the forearm, where we not only can move the hand at the wrist, but we can also move the whole forearm and hand with it. So I'll show you another example of that. So now we can rotate the whole forearm and the hand can rotate with it. So the hand can face down. Let's say if you're on all fours or you're putting your palms down on the desk, that would be the image here on the right, where your palm is facing down. Or you could rotate the hand the other way as if you were bringing food to your mouth and you needed to supinate. So this is pronation, this is supination. And now you can make these different movements to position the hand in different ways. And that's not the end of it, because we can also move at the wrist in two different ways. sideways or ulnar deviation, or sometimes called abduction or adduction, and flexion and extension here like this. And that makes it possible to move the hand in every spatial plane in order to grasp something. So now we can move the hand this way, we can move it this way, and we can move it this way. Every which way we can move it in order to position the hand in relation to objects in space to move them. And then we get another element getting more toward the extremity, where we're able not only to position the hand, but we're able to move the fingers in the most complex ways. For instance, we can move the fingers this way, we can move different digits and different fingers separately from the others. And one of the most important things we can do is we can move the thumb in relation to the other fingers. And because and not only move it in relation to the other fingers, but move it in relation to each one, so that we have quite a lot of precision in how we move the thumb. So if you see here in this image, make it bigger. If you think of the finger joints, we can move the fingers, but we really can't oppose fingers to other fingers. But the thumb as a whole can move in relation to all the other fingers, a little bit like this baseball mitt. For those of you who are familiar, with in American baseball, this would be like a catcher's mitt. The guy who stands behind the plate and has to have a very padded glove to catch the ball thrown very fast. In a catcher's mitt, you could see this big old thumb that moves low down here, making it possible to oppose the thumb to the other fingers. And that's where the joint would be. And that's where a key joint of the thumb is, right down near the wrist. And I'll show you that in a minute. So now you have this incredible flexibility of structure of the whole arm, making it highly mobile and strong and shock absorbing all at once. So it could do very, very strong, powerful athletic movements. It could absorb shock, and it could also move and position the hand in all kinds of ways. But then you also have the movement at the forearm and at the wrist to enable the hand to be positioned in precise ways. And then you have the ability of the fingers to move and the thumb to oppose the fingers. And even when you get to all of that, you haven't touched on the fact that the entire thing, in conjunction with the overall tensegrity structure, is itself a tensegrity structure. So if you look here, you can see these are the muscles in back of the shoulder, right? The trapezius, you can see latissimus here, trapezius, these big sheet muscles, the big muscles on the superficial part of the back, and then deeper deltoid over here, and then deeper ones like the rhomboid and some of the rotator cuff muscles. And you could see that far from being just a bunch of dumb muscles that pull on bones, these is a very complex structure that supports the whole shoulder girdle. And here's another image from the front, showing only three muscles, the two of the pectoral muscles and the serratus anterior, but you could see what a complex network there is. And that network is not just a bunch of muscles moving bones, it's a complex tensegrity structure. And when it works well, it works. I'm going to go back to this beautiful little girl. When it works well, it works something, I'm just scrolling. It works like that, very wide and open and naturally free, because that's how the shoulder works. It's got a beautiful design to it when we use it well. And in the end, the shoulder becomes not just another, a modified fin. It becomes something infinitely more complex than a fin of a fish. There's one more part of this I want to show you, which is kind of well, the sensory and motor part of it. So even when you've recognized the complexity of the structure, that it's a complex muscular, articular, system, the tensegrity elements of it, you've also got the fact that it's very sensitive sensory and motor structure that makes it possible to control the hand in extremely fine ways and to feel and explore the world in extremely refined ways. So here you've got a view of the brain showing where parts of the body are mapped out on the brain. And I'll just give a simple example of that. On each of the pads of your finger are something like 2,500 touch receptors. Each pad of each finger has 2,500 touch receptors. And what does that mean? Well, it means they're very sensitive nerve endings that are able to pick up on various kinds of forces like pressure, or if you very gently, stroke the skin, you feel that, or if there are hairs, you don't have that here, but if you have hairs on parts of the arm, you can feel the hair move. So we have different receptors that make it possible to sense movement, pressure, and changes in shape in your fingers. In order to pick up that information, those sensory receptors go to the brain on the opposite side, where the body is literally mapped out. So you could literally see part of the hand is sort of the part of the brain that receives that information from the hand is mapped out as a little part of the hand, and other parts of the body are mapped out alongside it. So adjacent parts to adjacent parts, and the parts of the body are mapped out in adjacent parts of the brain. And the same thing is happening at a motor level, so that where the sensory input comes in and is mapped out in your brain, you also have equivalent motor output mapped out into the hand and parts of and the arm. And here's an example of the motor pathways that go from the brain to parts of the motor system. And here's an example of some of the touch receptors in the skin that pick up all that sensory information. So what does it mean? It means in the end, the hand is not just, a fin of a fish that's been modified that enables the arm to be used to grasp things. The hand becomes the tool of tools. That's a quote from Aristotle, the philosopher, where he said the hand is a kind of tool for using tools. And it becomes this incredibly emergent, complex structure that makes it possible for us to change and alter and create the world that we came from. And in the same way, the whole motor system, the whole moving body, which is what we're looking at today, becomes, and here's some examples of the hand and different things you could do with your hand. So I have a couple of images here from the martial arts of these beautiful hand positions. I'll show you a couple of these. Here's another one showing some different, I think this is mostly karate. And I like that, just sort of elegant, how much we express with our hands. Here's two types of artists holding cigarettes. So the hand, part of the human form being upright, frees the hand to become a whole emergent creative structure. And then in the same way that the hand and shoulder girdle become this emergent creative structure, the body as a whole becomes an architectural moving machine, unlike anything you can imagine, even if people were trying to design it. And the moving body is an architectural marvel as well. So we could see from the animals that crawled out of the ocean to become moving terrestrial animals, we could see the development of the limbs, the development of the upright posture, the emergence of a whole new structure in using the arms. And that's only one of them. There are other features, but we're looking today mainly at the anatomy, and you could see what an amazing machine the whole thing becomes. And then in the end, we can sort of appreciate in form and moving, which is a phrase from Shakespeare of the beauty of the human body. We could see what an amazing architectural structure this really is here and here. So thank you very much for listening today. We're going to take a few questions. And I also wanted to point out, tomorrow we're going to be talking about skill and how it evolved, and another amazing emergent development and evolution. And next week, we're off on Monday because it's an American, for those of you who are not American, it's an American holiday, but we'll pick up on Tuesday and Wednesday. The talks this week will have the skill talk on Wednesday, and then Thursday, Tara and James will continue with the developmental movement. Okay?
Great, Ted.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a question here. Talking about the transformation into upright posture from the less upright primates, for example.
Yeah.
How did that change the movement of the mandible, the jaw?
I'd have to think about that. I'll just say a couple of things. I'm no expert on that subject, but it's clear that in the first upright humans, because they began to develop culture, their diet altered radically. So they were able to gather food, which they needed to chew, rather than kill and tear with the teeth. So they became the jaw became modified more for chewing than for tearing. That's why you get this whole different shape of the jaw. And a lot of that had to do with change of lifestyle and diet. And you could see here with this early, upright hominid, you could see that this is an animal that chews food. And another thing I think is that when humans were hunting and able to kill animals and eat meat, that made their diet much more nutrient rich. And so that enabled them to not spend as much time foraging and having to eat vegetables, like we see in animals like chimpanzees are sort of noshing all day. So I think all of these things led to a different function of the jaw, which becomes much more about the kind of diet they're eating. But there's probably more to say about that I'm not an expert on. Yeah.
Great. And the next question here about sitting in chairs and the relationship of sitting to evolution. Would you think sitting tends to diminish the lumbar curve?
That's a good question. Sitting is another emergent feature because the ability to come onto 2 feet also if you look at a chimpanzee, chimpanzees sit, they kind of squat, and they have a kind of, in fact, they're more upright when they're sitting than when they're standing. We saw yesterday that their tool use, the ability of a chimpanzee to use a twig to get a termite out of a mound, which is a kind of tool use, is coupled with sitting. So sitting becomes a kind of a new posture that makes possible use of the arms. And in humans, many of our most complex activities take place when we're sitting. So we're very well designed for sitting. And the notion that we've sort of compromised ourselves or that sitting is kind of a bad thing is more an expression of the fact that our lifestyle is harmful and that we sit badly, but we're actually quite well designed for sitting if we understand how the system works. I think in sitting, I would say there's a little bit perhaps less of a curve than in standing, because when you're standing, the femur, the leg, is fully extended. And when you're sitting, it's flexed, and that reduces the lumbar curve, but you still are a fully upright creature with inherent curves. So if sitting reduces the curves in such a way that there's any kind of shortening or collapse in the spine, that's not how we're designed. We're meant to have some curvature as part of being upright. So I would say that sitting reduces the lumbar curve a bit, but does not remove those fundamental curves that enable upright posture.
Okay, thanks, Ted. And one last question.
Yep.
Assuming that we are designed for upright posture, why do babies not come out of the womb fully upright?
Because the more complex the animal, the more time the animal takes to catch up with its mature state. So that, some animals, simpler animals, mature in a matter of weeks. But other more complex animals, I think the gestation of a period of an elephant is like 500 days, is even long. I forget how long it is, much longer even than humans. In order for an animal, you could say like a human that is so advanced, has to traverse a longer period of its own phylogenetic or evolutionary history to catch up. So that when a baby is born, it's in a quite immature state relative to where it has to get to. In fact, the baby, even at birth, is still in gestation because the skull has to get bigger. And to allow childbirth, the skull can't be too big. So there's a lot of maturing that has to happen. And so we have to sort of recapitulate some of those stages that we go through in order to become fully human. And there's a lot of it that involves learning. If you think about what happens to animals that come on land, of course, it's all programmed to happen, but it also involves learning and effort. And you see that happening in the baby. So a baby is learning to crawl and learning to sit. And at the same time, it's developing strength in muscles. So it has to actually go through that difficult process of becoming upright. So,
okay.
Thank you very much. Anything else, James?
No, that's it for today, Ted.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow. We're talking on skill and then Thursday on developmental movement with Tara and James. Thanks for joining.